There is a desk at Cirey in Champagne where a woman of 42 sat through the short nights of the summer of 1749 with her feet in a basin of cold water so that she would not fall asleep. On the desk, a stack of manuscript in 2 languages, a pot of coffee gone bitter, a small clock she had stopped looking at, because the answer it gave her was always the same, and her own swelling belly pressed against the table's edge. She was the most learned woman in France. She was racing 2 things at once, and she knew that only one of them could be finished in time, the book or the child. She meant to finish the book. Her name was Gabrielle Émilie Le Tonnelier de Breteuil, Marquise du Châtelet, and the men of the Académie des Sciences in Paris had a private word for her that they did not use to her face. They called her among themselves an exception. It was the politest insult the century had. An exception meant a woman who could do the work, yes, we admit it, but please understand that she proves nothing, changes nothing, that the rule still holds and the door stays shut. Emily had heard the word reported back to her by a friend who thought it would amuse her. It did not amuse her. She sat with it for a moment, then said that she would rather be a rule than an exception, and went back to her equations. The pair in this story are real, the Marquise and the man France knew as Voltaire. The reconstruction of their conversations draws on their surviving letters and the memoirs of those who watched them quarrel. To understand the woman at that desk, you have to go back 15 years, to a January night in Paris, when she walked into the wrong supper on purpose. She was 27 then, married 8 years, a mother 3 times over, and bored in the specific, dangerous way of a clever person who has been told her whole life that her cleverness is a kind of decoration. Her husband, the Marquis Florent Claude du Châtelet, was a soldier, a decent, dull, frequently absent man who had given her a title, 3 children, and the one gift she valued above all the others, without ever quite understanding why. He left her alone. He was at his garrison, she was in Paris, and she had heard that a certain poet, recently out of the Bastille and not for the first time, would be at the table that evening. The poet was 40. He went by a name he had invented for himself out of an anagram and a grudge, the way he invented most things: Voltaire. He had a face like a blade that had been used too often, all edge and quickness, eyes that took the measure of a room in the time it took another man to bow. He had been thrown into the Bastille at 23 for a poem, and out of France for a beating he took from a nobleman's servants, and was not permitted to revenge because he was a commoner, and the nobleman was not. He carried that beating inside him for the rest of his life, the way some men carry a war. He was the cleverest man in France, and he had been made, repeatedly, brutally, to understand that clever was not the same as safe. So when the Marquise du Châtelet sat down across from him, and, before the soup was cold, corrected a point he had made about the velocity of falling bodies, corrected it not with a woman's flattering hesitation, but flatly with a number, Voltaire did the thing that almost no one in his life had ever made him do. He stopped talking. He looked at her. And then he laughed, the real laugh, not the salon laugh, and leaned across the table and asked her where in God's name she had learned that. She had learned it, she told him, from a man named Maupertuis, who had agreed to teach her geometry on the condition that she tell no one, because a tutor known to be improving a married marquise's mind, rather than something else about her, would be a scandal of the wrong kind. She had learned it at a cafe where women were not admitted, by sending a footman in with her questions written on cards, and waiting in the carriage for the answers. She had learned it, in other words, the way the century forced a woman to learn anything that mattered, sideways, in secret, at a cost. Here's the gap, and it is wider than it looks. Voltaire was a commoner, and that was a wall he spent his life climbing and being thrown back down from. But Emily was an aristocrat, born into the Breteuil family, presented at court as a girl, raised among people who owned provinces. By the arithmetic of the era, she stood far above the poet. And yet, her rank bought her gowns, jewels, a box at the opera, a husband, and a permanent, polite, total exclusion from the only thing she wanted, the company of men who did the work. The academy was closed to her. The universities were closed to her. The learned societies that would, decades later, elect lesser men by the dozen would not have her at any price, for any sum, on any condition. Her brother, less gifted by every account, could have walked through any of those doors. She had been born on the wrong side of one wall and the wrong side of another, and the two walls did not cancel out. They multiplied. What she wanted from Voltaire was not, at first, love. It was conversation. It was a man who would not perform astonishment when she spoke, who would not say, "But how charming, a woman who reads." It was someone to be wrong with, because that she had already understood was the part no one would give her. They would let her be decorative. They would even, grudgingly, let her be right, now and then, as a curiosity. What they would not let her be was a working mind that fails and corrects and tries again in the company of equals, which is the only way a mind actually grows. Voltaire, sitting across that table, was the first person who looked at her and saw not an exception, but a colleague. It would be years before either of them admitted it had also become something more. The supper ended near dawn. He walked her to her carriage through the cold, both of them still arguing about Newton, whom France had not yet accepted, whom the French still answered with the elegant, wrong, comfortable physics of their own Descartes. She held the Englishman was right. Voltaire, who had lived in England and seen the apple country for himself, agreed in principle, but had not done the mathematics. Because the mathematics was very hard and he cheerfully admitted, a poet who could fake his way through more of it than most, but not through that. Then do it properly, she said. Or let me. The carriage door was open. The footman was waiting. She put one gloved hand on the frame and looked back at him and said the thing that would, in time, reorganize both their lives. I will give you the calculus, if you give me the rest of the world. I have no other way to get it. He did not answer that night. He went home and wrote, in a letter that survives, that he had met a woman who frightened him, and that he had not been frightened by anything in a long time, and that he intended to see her again at the first opportunity, because a man should run toward the thing that frightens him, if the thing is also the truth. He underlined truth. Voltaire underlined very little. He saw her again within the week. What neither of them could see that first night was the shape of what they were starting. They thought it was an affair, or a partnership, or a salon friendship of the kind Paris produced and consumed by the season. It was none of those, or it was all of them, and something else underneath. It was the beginning of 15 years in which a Marquise and a commoner poet would build, in a half-ruined house on the edge of France, the closest thing the 18th century had to a laboratory run by a woman, and in which she would do, in the last summer of her life, with her child kicking under the desk and the candle burning down, a thing that no person of her sex had been permitted to do before, and that she did anyway, because the door was shut, and she had decided, long ago in a carriage at dawn, that a shut door was not the same as an answer. It is worth seeing, before we go on, exactly what that sideways learning cost her in the daily flesh of it, because the century made a woman pay for knowledge in a currency men were never charged. The café was the Grado, on the quai near the Pont Neuf, where the mathematicians of Paris took their coffee and their arguments, and where a woman could not sit. Emily had tried. She had walked in once, plainly dressed, on the arm of a tutor, and the room had gone the particular silence a room goes when something improper has occurred, and the proprietor had come over with the bow that means leave, and she had left. So she did the thing she always did. She found the back way. She had a suit of men's clothes made, a coat, breeches, a plain waistcoat, and she walked into the Grado dressed as a young scholar. And the mathematicians, who knew exactly who she was, played along with enormous delight, because they were intellectuals, and a transgression of pure form pleased them. And they argued vortices and fluxions with her for an afternoon, and called her monsieur, and laughed about it for years. It is the kind of anecdote that gets told as charming. Look at it again. A great lady of France, daughter of a baron, had to put on a man's coat to be allowed to sit in a coffee house and ask a question about geometry. The clothes were the only key that fit. She had them made, the way another woman would order a ball gown, and she wore them to do the one thing the ball gowns could never get her into. They will say, "You are mad," a friend told her, meaning it kindly. They already say I am an exception, she answered. Mad is a promotion. Mad at least is a thing a person does. An exception is a thing that is done to you. She kept the men's clothes. Years later at Cirey, a visitor found the coat in a press and asked about it, and she said only that it had been the most useful garment she ever owned, and changed the subject. And the visitor, who wrote it down without understanding it, thought she was being whimsical. She was not being whimsical. She was telling the exact truth and trusting him to miss it, which, being a man of his century, he obligingly did. The Marquis, when he was eventually told that his wife and the poet had taken up residence together at one of his own neglected estates to study natural philosophy, considered the matter and gave his blessing. He was a sensible man. His wife was happy, the house was being repaired at the poet's expense, and the arrangement spared him the trouble of either entertaining her or explaining her. He visited sometimes. He liked Voltaire. The three of them dined together with perfect civility, and the Century, which had a name and a sneer for everything, did not quite have one for this. They settled on calling it Cirey, after the house, as though the place itself were the scandal. In a sense it was. The scandal was not who shared whose bed. The scandal, though it took society some years to understand this, was a woman doing physics with the door open. It began, as so much of Voltaire's life began, with a warrant. In the spring of 1734, he published a small book praising the English, their tolerance, their commerce, their Newton, their habit of not jailing men for sentences, which the French authorities correctly read as an attack on everything France was, and ordered burned by the public hangman. A lettre de cachet went out for the author's arrest. This was the king's signature on a slip of paper. No trial, no charge a man could answer, just a name and a destination, usually a cell. Voltaire did the only sensible thing. He ran. He ran to Cirey. The house sat on the border of Champagne and Lorraine, which mattered because Lorraine was not yet France, and a man could cross from one to the other in an afternoon if the warrant came too close. It was Emily's idea. It was also Emily's husband's house, which made it perhaps the strangest sanctuary in Europe. A fugitive poet, hiding in the country seat of the soldier whose wife he loved, with the soldier's cheerful permission. The Marquis, away with his regiment, sent word that the poet was welcome to repair the roof. The roof needed it. Cirey, when they arrived, was a damp, half-abandoned manor, with a leaking gallery and rooms no one had heated in 20 years. They poured money into it, Voltaire's money mostly, made from a lottery he had once cornered through arithmetic that the organizers had not thought a poet capable of. And they built, room by room, not a love nest, but an institution. A library of many thousands of volumes, a private collection on the scale of a small university's, a gallery of scientific instruments shipped from London and Paris, air pumps, prisms, a telescope, scales accurate to a grain, glass globes for the study of electricity, a small laboratory where they burned things and weighed the ash to see where the missing weight had gone. Workmen who had been hired to make a gentleman's house comfortable found themselves installing apparatus they could not name, for experiments they could not imagine. At the direction of a Marquise in a working gown, who knew exactly what she wanted and the exact price she would pay for it. The neighbors did not know what to make of it. A great lady was supposed to keep a great house, hunts, dinners, the parade of rank visiting rank. Instead, the Marquise du Châtelet kept hours that horrified them. She rose at noon because she had worked until dawn. She received guests in a study, not a drawing room. She had a forge of the mind running in the heart of Champagne, and the only people admitted to it were those who could keep up, which in practice meant Voltaire, a rotating handful of visiting savants, and increasingly no one because there were so few who could. To understand why she could do this, why she alone, of all the clever women the century produced and wasted, you have to understand where she came from, and what one improbable man had done for her when she was a child. Her father, the Baron de Breteuil, held a post at Versailles whose entire function was the management of foreigners and ceremony, and he was, by the standards of his class, a freak. He believed his daughter should be educated, not finished, educated. When the girl showed, at 10, a turn for languages and numbers that her mother found unladylike and frankly alarming, the Baron overrode the mother and brought in tutors, real ones, the kind hired for sons. By 12, she had Latin, Italian, and enough Greek to be dangerous. She fenced. She rode astride. She was tall and not pretty by the cruel measure of the salons, all elbows and intensity. And her mother despaired of marrying her well, and was, in the end, wrong to. There is a story from those years that she told against herself, later, laughing. As a girl, she had wanted books she was not given money to buy. So she took the small allowance she did have to the card tables, where great ladies gambled away fortunes as a form of conversation. And she did not gamble the way they did, on feeling and luck. She gambled on the odds. She had worked out, alone, with no one to teach her, the rudiments of what a mathematician would later call probability, which bets paid and which only seemed to. And she won, quietly, steadily, enough to buy the books, until the older women began to notice that the Breteuil girl never lost much, and never won spectacularly, and always, somehow, walked away with exactly what she had come for. It was the first time her arithmetic bought her something the world would not give her freely. It would not be the last. Years later, deep in debt at court from a single catastrophic night, she would sit down and design a system to claw it back, treating the gaming table as the mechanical problem it was. And she half succeeded, which, at those tables, counted as a miracle. This was the woman Voltaire had found. Not a blue-stocking playing at learning to fill the hours, a gambler who calculated, a baron's overeducated daughter who had been handed, by one eccentric father, the single thing the century denied almost every other woman of her gifts: a beginning. Everything after, the secret geometry lessons, the cards smuggled into the cafe, the marriage that conveniently removed itself to a garrison, was her extending that beginning by whatever means the world left open, which were never the front doors. And here was the second wall, the one even her father's gift could not breach, and it is worth standing at it for a moment, because it is where the whole story turns. Voltaire wanted Newton spread through France. France resisted Newton not out of stupidity but out of pride and habit. Descartes was French. His physics was elegant. His vortices of swirling matter were taught in every college. And to accept the Englishman's invisible force reaching across empty space, gravity, acting at a distance, on nothing, for no reason anyone could see, felt to the French like surrendering. Voltaire could write the propaganda. He could make Newton fashionable, witty, quotable. What he could not do was the mathematics, and Newton without the mathematics is a rumor. The Principia is not a book of opinions. It is a fortress of geometry, proposition built on proposition, and to bring it into French, really into French, not a summary, but the thing itself with the proofs intact, required someone who could follow Newton step for step and, where his 70-year-old geometry had since been overtaken by the newer calculus, rebuild the argument in the modern form, so that a French savant could check every line. There was, in all of France, perhaps a handful of people who could have done it. Most of them were members of the Académie that would not admit her. Only one of them was sitting at Châtelet with those thousands of books, and nothing in the world she would rather do. The match was not romantic. The match was structural. France needed the translation. The translation needed a particular mind. The mind existed in a body the institutions refused to let through the door. And so the work came to her, by the back way, the only way, the way she had got everything. Voltaire understood this before she fully admitted it to herself. He wrote to a friend that the Marquise was building the only thing at Châtelet that would outlast them both, and that he, the famous one, the one all Europe wrote to, suspected he would be remembered in the end as the man who had lived with her. He was not always so gracious about it, and that is the truer part of the story. They competed. In 1738, the Academy announced a prize for an essay on the nature of fire, and both of them entered, in secret, each from the other. Voltaire wrote his in the open, with her help. Emily wrote hers at night, after he was asleep, on a subject they had argued about for months. She thought he was wrong about fire having weight, and she was, as it happened, closer to right than he was. Neither of them won the prize, but both essays were judged good enough to be printed by the Academy. And that was the thing. The Academy that would not seat her, would not so much as let her attend a lecture, printed her physics. Anonymously at first, then under her name once it was out. They would publish the work of a woman. They would not be in a room with her while she did it. She kept the printed essay. A friend who saw it years later said she kept it the way other women kept a love letter. There was a third person in the house at Châtelet, and the histories tend to forget him, which would have annoyed him and amused her. The Marquis de Châtelet came home on leave. Picture the arithmetic of that homecoming. A soldier returns to his own estate to find it transformed. His leaking gallery, now a library of many thousands of books. His cold salons full of brass instruments. His wife keeping a scholar's hours, and the most notorious poet in France installed in the best guest rooms, repairing the roof with money the poet himself had won off a lottery. A different man would have drawn a sword. The Marquis sat down to dinner and asked, with genuine interest, what an air pump was for. He was not a fool, whatever the salons assumed of a man whose wife so visibly outshone him. He was something rarer in that century and that class, a man entirely without vanity about his own importance. He had married a girl far cleverer than himself and had decided, early, that this was good luck rather than insult. He liked his wife. He liked her happy. He had observed that she was happier with Voltaire in a telescope than she had ever been with him in a hunting party, and he had drawn the sensible conclusion and adjusted his expectations downward and his comfort upward. And he visited when the regiment allowed, and he was fond of them both. There is a small scene from one of those visits, reported by a guest. The three of them at supper, the candles lit, Voltaire holding forth on some court intrigue, Emily correcting a date, the Marquis eating his soup and watching the two of them spark off each other like flint and steel. And at last, the Marquis setting down his spoon and saying, mildly, to the guest beside him, that he had the most interesting marriage in France and had done nothing whatever to deserve it. He said it without bitterness. He said it the way a man remarks on good weather he has not earned. The guest recorded it as proof of the Marquis's simplicity. It was proof of something else, something the century had almost no language for, that a man could love a woman by getting out of her way, and that the Marquis du Châtelet, dull, decent, frequently absent, gave his brilliant wife the one thing that all her rank and all her genius could not have purchased on the open market, a husband who let her be exactly what she was, and never once asked her to be smaller. When she died, it was the Marquis who arranged for her papers, the Marquis who confirmed where the great Manuscript lay. The poet wept and wrote letters to all of Europe. The husband, quietly, made sure the book was safe. The century gave the credit, then and since, to the men who made the noise. But the door at Châtelet had stayed open for 15 years, partly because one ordinary man had decided, against every instinct his rank had trained into him, simply to hold it. The quarrel that broke them as lovers happened over a manuscript page, which was the only thing that could have broken them, because pages were the one ground on which they had never learned to lie to each other. It was late, past 2, the candles down to stubs. She had been reworking a section of the Newton where the old geometry would not carry the argument cleanly, and she had torn it out, Newton's own scaffolding, and rebuilt the proof in the calculus, the new way, the harder way, the way that actually closed the gap he had left open. She brought it to Voltaire because she brought everything to Voltaire. He read it. He was tired and his eyes were bad, and he had spent the day on a tragedy that was not going well. And he said the thing a smaller man says when a larger mind has just walked past him in the dark. He said it was probably correct, but who would ever read it? That she was burying herself in proofs no salon would thank her for. That she might better spend her gifts making Newton charming, the way he did, rather than making him impregnable, the way no one had asked her to. She set the page down. You make him fashionable, she said. I make him true. Fashionable lasts a season. You of all people should know which one survives. Emily, you resent it. She said it without heat, which was worse. Not the work. The fact that I can do the part you can't. You can read every language in Europe and charm every court, and you cannot follow this page. And it costs you something to sit across from a woman who can. Say it. We have never needed to flatter each other. Don't start tonight. He did not say it, which was the same as saying it. He was Voltaire. He had been the cleverest person in every room of his life until he walked into the wrong supper in Paris and corrected a Marquise on falling bodies and got a number back. He loved her, and he could not entirely forgive her for being, on the one terrain he could not master, simply better. There is a letter from around this time, not to her, in which he describes her as a great man whose only fault is being a woman, which he meant, God help him, as the highest praise he had, and which tells you everything about the size of the cage and the size of the people inside it. They stopped being lovers somewhere in there and stayed something rarer and more durable. Collaborators who had loved each other and now simply could not be parted. Two people who had built a life out of the same thousands of books and could no more separate than a proof could separate from its premise. He took, eventually, a mistress in Paris, his own niece as it turned out, which the century found less remarkable than it ought to have. And Emily, who was 41 and had spent 15 years being the mind in the room and not, for a long time now, the body anyone reached for, did a thing that surprised everyone, including herself. She fell in love, badly, completely, with a man 10 years younger who was not worth it. His name was Jean-François de Saint-Lambert. He was a soldier and a poet, the second of these only just, a writer of the kind of polished, forgettable verse the age produced like weather. He was handsome. He was at the court of Luneville in Lorraine, where Emily and Voltaire were guests of the exiled Polish king who kept a little Versailles of his own there. And he paid attention to her, the woman, not the Marquise, not the geometer, not Voltaire's famous companion, in a way that no one had in years. And she went toward it the way a person who has been cold for a long time goes toward a fire, knowing it is only a fire, not caring. Voltaire found out the way he found out everything, suddenly and badly. He walked in on them. There is a scene, reported by more than one memoirist, of the great man white with rage, shouting in French and then, because rage needs distance, in a sentence of something else, and Emily answering him in the cold, clear voice she used for fools and undergraduates, that he had no standing to be jealous, that he had his niece in Paris, that they had not been lovers in years, that she had given him the best of her life and her mind and would go on giving it, but that her heart was hers to spend and she had spent it, and he might rage or he might be her friend, but he could not be both, and she would rather he chose the friend because she could not finish the Newton without him. She put it almost exactly like that. She had a quarrel about her own heart, and she ended it with a sentence about a deadline. He chose the friend. Within days, they were correcting proofs together again, the three of them now, the poet she had loved and the poet she loved, in a house in Lorraine while the work went on. Luneville was where it happened, and Luneville needs a moment, because the place explains the fall. Lorraine had been settled on Stanislav Leszczynski, the deposed king of Poland, father-in-law to Louis XV, to hold for his lifetime, after which it would pass to France. A charming, idle, defeated old man who had lost a throne and built himself a miniature one instead. His court at Luneville was a toy Versailles, the same gilt, the same etiquette, the same intrigues, scaled down and run for amusement rather than power. It was a place of long suppers and longer flirtations, of clever people with nothing urgent to do, and it was, for a working mind like Emily's, both a delight and a trap. She had come there with Voltaire. She stayed for someone else. Saint Lambert was an officer of the Duke's Guard and a poet of the carpet, the kind who reads his verses aloud to ladies after dinner and watches their faces. He was 32 to her 41. He was good-looking in the bland way of men who have never had to be anything else, and he did the one thing that, after 15 years, no one had done for Emily in a long time. He looked at her as a woman to be wanted, rather than a mind to be consulted. Voltaire admired her. The savants of Europe corresponded with her. Her husband was fond of her. But desire, simple, foolish, unearned desire, the kind that has nothing to do with what you have accomplished, that had quietly left her life while she was busy, and she had told herself she did not miss it, the way busy people do, and she had been lying. She knew exactly what he was. That is the part that breaks your heart a little. She was the most clear-eyed woman of her century. She could calculate the odds on anything, and she sat down and wrote, to a friend, a near-perfect description of St. Lambert's shallowness, his vanity, the certainty that he would disappoint her, and then went to him anyway. "I know what he is," she wrote, in effect. "I have decided to be happy for as long as it lasts and to pay the bill when it comes." She treated her own heart the way she treated a wager she knew was bad but wanted to make. Eyes open, terms understood, the loss already priced in. A lesser woman would have deceived herself. She refused even that comfort. She walked in knowing. There is a letter she wrote to him that survives, and it is not the letter of a foolish older woman, whatever the memoirists wanted it to be. It is fierce and exact, and a little terrifying. She tells him she has loved few people in her life, and loved them completely, that she does not know how to do it by halves, that she is aware he cannot match her, and asks only that he not lie to her about it, because she can bear loss but not deception. It is the letter of a person who has decided to spend something precious and finite on something that does not deserve it, and who has done the sum, and who is spending it anyway, on purpose, because the alternative was to die never having spent it at all. Read it once and you will never again call her a blue stocking. There was a furnace in her. The physics was only the part she could publish. Then, in the spring of 1749, she missed her courses, and she knew, with the cold accuracy she brought to everything, exactly what it meant and exactly what the odds were. She was 42. A first child at 42 was dangerous in that century. A fifth, after a long gap, to a woman of her age, was something closer to a sentence. Women died of childbirth at 20 in clean houses. She knew the numbers. She always knew the numbers. And the numbers said she would very likely not survive it. She wrote to a friend, plainly, without self-pity, that she was probably going to die, and that this was bad timing, because she had not finished her book. That is the sentence I keep returning to. Not, "I am afraid," not, "I am wronged." Bad timing. She had a year of work left in the Newton, and by her own calculation, less than a year of life. And she did the arithmetic the way she had done the arithmetic at the card tables, when she was a girl buying books with money no one would give her. She worked out what she could win against what she would certainly lose, and she made her bet. She would finish the book. If the book and the child both arrived, good. If only one could, it would be the book, because the book was the thing the world had told her she could not do, and the child was the thing the world had always allowed, demanded, reduced her to. She would not spend her last months being what they had always wanted her to be. She would spend them finishing the thing they swore she couldn't. So she went back to Cirey, and to the desk, and to the basin of cold water for her feet, and she wrote to St. Lambert, and to Voltaire, and to her old tutor's circle for help checking the proofs, and she set herself a deadline against her own body. The household watched her do it with a kind of horror. Friends begged her to rest. The midwives wanted her in bed. She kept the candles burning and her feet in the cold, and her pen moving, page after page of the hardest mathematics in Europe, racing a clock she had stopped looking at because she already knew what it said. She finished it. That is the first thing to say, because everything else is sad and that part is not. Before the last book there had been another, and it tells you what kind of mind she truly was, because she wrote it for a child. Some years earlier, dissatisfied with every physics text in French, Emily had sat down and written her own, The Institutions de Physique, a clear, ordered account of the natural philosophy of her age, the colliding systems of Newton and the great German philosopher Leibniz set side by side and weighed. She wrote it, she said, for her son, so that a boy might have from his mother the grounding that the schools would give him badly or not at all. Think about that arrangement for a moment. The universities that would not admit her produced the textbooks her son would study. So she wrote him a better one herself, at the kitchen table of natural philosophy, a mother teaching the next century out of the back of the house because the front of the house was barred to her. It was published, argued over by the learned men of Europe, and drawn into a public quarrel with the secretary of the Academy himself, who had taken issue with her on a point of force, and who found, to his visible discomfort, that the Marquise answered in print precisely and gave no ground. That quarrel was part of the largest scientific dispute of her lifetime, and it is the place where her own original contribution sits, So it is worth getting right. The question sounds dry and is not. When a moving body strikes another, what exactly is the quantity that carries over, the thing that does the damage, the measure of its force? One camp, following Newton, said it was the body's mass, multiplied simply by its speed. The other, following Leibniz, said no, it was the mass multiplied by the speed squared, the velocity taken twice. The difference seems small on paper. It is the difference between a slap and a catastrophe, because squaring a number grows it monstrously. Double the speed and you do not double the force, you quadruple it. A musket ball at twice the velocity does not strike twice as hard but 4 times as hard. And anyone who has ever watched 2 falling weights of the same size leave craters of wildly different depth has stood, without knowing it, inside the answer to that 18th century argument. Emily took the squared term, and she did not merely argue it, she tested it, which is the thing the cliché of the lady translator always leaves out. She drew on the experiments of a Dutch investigator who had dropped brass balls into soft clay and measured the craters. A ball moving twice as fast did not sink twice as deep. It sank 4 times as deep, the square staring up out of the clay like a confession. She marshaled the evidence, she did the mathematics, she published, and she helped move the French, slowly against their Cartesian pride, toward the answer that turned out to be right. The quantity she defended is, in the language physics later settled on, the energy of motion. It is taught to every school child on the planet. She did not get her name on it. She got something she may have valued more, though no one thought to ask her. She got it correct, in print, under a woman's name, while the men who would not seat her read it and could not refute it. So when she sat at the desk that last summer, racing the Newton against her own body, she was not a copyist finishing a translation. She was a working physicist who had already changed the argument once, closing the most important book of the age, in the only country that mattered for it, in the only language she could give it, with the proofs rebuilt in her own hand. The pregnancy did not interrupt a hobby. It threatened to silence one of the 3 or 4 real natural philosophers in France, and she knew it. And that is why she would not stop. And that is why the candle burned to the socket night after night, while the household begged her to rest, and she did the arithmetic of her remaining hours and kept writing. In the late summer of 1749, in the small hours, at the desk with the basin and the bitter coffee and the stopped clock, Emily du Châtelet wrote the last lines of her translation and commentary on Newton's Principia and dated the work. The manuscript was complete. The full text in French,